Mode.
Good evening, First Robotics community. My name is Sean Lim, and I'd like to welcome you to another episode of Ask the Experts. This evening, we're going to be talking about the Ontario District events during week 4 and 5, which were the Waterloo, Georgian, Western, and Windsor events. On top of that, we're going to take a brief look at the qualification points so far in the province and see who the movers and shakers were and if we had any surprises. Joining us this evening on our panel, we've got two great guests with us. Firstly, we have a student from Team 4001, Paulina Phang-Lyn. She's the Public Relations Lead from 4001. Paulina, great to have you on board. How are you doing this evening?
I'm doing great. So
Awesome.
excited to be here.
We're excited to have you as well, Paulina. And in addition to Paulina, we also have Max Guan, who is the mentor and drive coach of FRC Team 1285, the Big Bang. Max, how are you doing this evening?
I'm doing swell. How are you?
Awesome. And so this might be a little bit of a lengthy one because we did have 4 events that went on these past 2 weekends. Excuse me. And so without further ado, let's take a moment and take a look at the district points leaderboard in the Ontario district currently. And up on the screen, I've got the official rankings from the first headquarters website. And on the screen, we can kind of see the top 14 in here. And we still have 2 more district events to play before we determine who our top 60 are, who will qualify for the district championships. But we're starting to see that there are some teams who have already qualified for the district championships by winning chairman's awards. Excuse me. But also having said that, there are a few teams who've probably earned enough district points that they're comfortably going to make it into that top 60. And I would say these people that we're looking at here in the top 14 or so have probably hit that stage. But there are obviously some surprises and maybe not so big surprises in this list. But I wanted to swing this over to our panelists in terms of where the points have shaped up so far and what your thoughts are and if you feel there have been any surprises. But I'll swing this one over to Paulina first. Paulina, what are your thoughts on the rankings so far? Any surprises or any notables?
At this point, I think most of the top teams are in the top 10. There's still a few missing ones, such as 2056, which we expect to kind of jump quite a few spots after this week, where they'll be competing at, I believe, McMaster. But most of the teams that are in the top 10, they have done really well this season, and I am not really surprised by any of them being in the top 10.
Max, how about for you, though? Are there any teams here that have caught your eye for one reason or another?
Yeah, Team Lynx, number 6378, had a pretty breakout season. I believe they've doubled up on finalists. And they actually worked with Robotics, who picked up the win this past week. And that's just really awesome to see a young team coming and seating so high above all of these other veteran teams that haven't yet either gotten these points or haven't had the success that Lynx has seen.
And not only have they doubled up on finalists, but they've done it in sort of a very steep upward trend because at Ryerson, although they were finalists, it looks like in terms of alliance selection, they were one of the last picks to be made, and they were part of that finalist alliance as that third member. However, at the Western event just this past weekend, it looks like in terms of alliance selection, they captained the number 2 alliance. So that's a huge difference to go from being one of the last picks in eliminations and being a finalist versus captaining your own alliance to be finalists at the event. And that Western event was a very competitive one. They lost to a pretty formidable alliance of Makeshift and Raider. But yeah, I think this was a team that caught our eye even at Ryerson, where we kind of just said that they were strong rookies, but to follow that up with an even more impressive performance at Western, if they continue this upward trend, I'm not sure exactly where they'll end up when it comes time to compete at the district championships. So another pretty interesting one. Max, any other ones which may have caught your eye?
I think 610 is definitely a team that looks really good up there. And having played with them this past week just really goes to show that when you have such a simple idea of going to the feeder station, getting a gear, coming back and putting it on, then you now look at an elite team's mastery of such an art where if anyone knows how their gear mechanism actually works, it kind of floats around, which makes it really, really quick. And there's actually sensors that throw the gears onto the peg once it's on. And it just goes to show that a team doesn't necessarily need to focus on balls, and I think we're going to touch on this later in the webcast, and they can do incredibly, incredibly well at both Ryerson, a very competitive district event, as well as Windsor.
Well, that's an interesting point to make, because if you look at our breakdown of maybe the top 14 that we can see here, and we compare which robots have really been gear-focused robots versus shooting-focused robots, and not to use 1285 and 1241 as an example, but even within your own school, excuse me, you kind of have that dichotomy there where 1285 has been the gear-focused robot, whereas 1241 was really supposed to primarily be a shooter, based on at least what I've seen on the robot. Maybe you'll refute that, Max, but it seems like we've got a good number of gear cyclists up here. I'm not necessarily going to say that gear cycling has been the more successful strategy, but I think it's just more so we've got a lot more gear specialists than we do shooters. But we can then sort of say exactly what you just said, Max, about 610 and gears. We can probably say the same thing about 1114 and shooting, where they've really kind of honed in on one very specific key element to the game, which in their case is shooting, and more specifically shooting an autonomous and collecting balls from the hoppers. And they're no slouches either, being ranked fourth. Well, Paulina, maybe I'll swing a question over to you in terms of the breakdown here. Are you surprised at all seeing how many gear specialists we have here versus how many shooters we have here, or does that seem totally in line with what your thoughts are?
This seems totally in line, because at the beginning of the season, when you're strategizing, you definitely think a lot about, oh yeah, the gears are going to do really well, but the balls are going to be the deciding factor in the playoff games, and that's kind of what's happened so far. I know we'll touch on this later with the balls versus gears, but with all the gear bots that are on the top 14, yeah, they're all really good at what they do, and it's not surprising that they're up there, especially when they can do 5, 6, 7, 8 gears per match, and that can get you up to the Four Rotors if you align with someone who can do similar in your abilities.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that one, where I'm not really surprised by the breakdown in the top few, because maybe earlier on I would have been surprised, wondering, oh well, why aren't there more fuel shooters who are rising to the top? But the gears still have predominantly dominated the strategies, with the fuel only being sort of an incremental difference. But as the season wears on, and we'll talk about this later on, I think fuel is getting more and more important. But outside of these top 14 here, there's a few teams we need to keep an eye on. And of course, 2056 already came up, but right underneath them, 4976, who was also a pretty darn capable shooter, is just kind of waiting in the wings there. And I think there was another one here who still hasn't played their second. 865 showed that they were a pretty capable shooter at their first event. And yeah, I think as we get into district champs, those fuel shooters, I think, will kind of become more and more important as we go, and hopefully they improve a little bit too, just to the level where they can start hitting that 40 kPa. I think there's a few of them which we're not quite at that level yet, where if you don't hit that 40 kPa, may not be so useful to shoot. But as the season wears on and they continue to get better and better and better, I think we'll start seeing some shooters rise more to the top. All right, so speaking now on points, 2 weeks ago, rather, we introduced the audience to a site called frclocks.com, which is very similar to the site that we just shown you, showing a breakdown of all the points in our district. But this one adds a little bit more information in terms of who has 100% secured their spot at champs based on the number of points they have and how many points are still left available. So this is a cool site because for some teams, they've earned enough points that it is actually mathematically impossible for them to drop out of the top 60 now. And so they've basically secured their spot at district championships. And so those teams on this website are highlighted in green. Those of them who are highlighted in blue are qualified because they've also won a district chairman's award. Excuse me. And what's kind of interesting here is that a lot of people were wondering, well, the district chairman's award, if that is an automatic qualifier to the district championships, aren't we potentially taking away spots from, our top point getters in those top 60 spots? And what we're seeing, and we kind of knew this before we moved to the district model, our district chairman's award winners generally also build pretty good robots that perform well. And we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 here in the top 16 alone. And in terms of our remaining district chairman's winners, we still have 2 more events to go. I'm not going to be surprised if they end up also being already in the top few point earners anyways. But we're seeing the breakdown here where at around 82 points, you have more than 100% secured your spot. And there's a few, into the 70s and 60s area where the percentages are still pretty high that they're likely going to make it to district champs based on the number of points that they have. But there are some teams now where they have been mathematically eliminated and are highlighted in red from being able to qualify for the district champs. But if you're curious about where your team currently stands in terms of your district championship qualification status, this is a really great site. Share it with your mentors, especially if you guys are needing to make preparations for going out to the event. All right, so moving on from that site, what I'd like to do now is maybe talk about our 4 different events that happened, which were Waterloo, Georgian, Windsor, and Western. And I'm going to have the blue lines open for those 4 events to maybe just compare and contrast what we saw at each of those events. But I'm a little bit weak on the Waterloo event because I was not able to attend, unfortunately, because I personally was at the Georgian event. But we'll bring this one over to our panelists. Paulina, I think you had a chance to watch at least a few of the Waterloo matches, but would you mind sharing your thoughts on what you saw at the Waterloo event? Anything notable, anything surprising to you?
I was actually at Georgian. I was competing at Georgian, which made it a little hard to do Waterloo, but I kept trying to keep up with the stats. Waterloo was definitely a high-scoring event. There were, I think, a couple four-rotor matches, maybe not in playoffs, but I think there were a few in quals, which was great. Really impressive, but not very surprising. When you look at past Waterloo events, you kind of determine that, or you kind of assume that Waterloo is always going to be one of the top scoring events, at least in Ontario.
Yeah. Max, your thoughts on Waterloo?
I think Waterloo was probably one of the first demonstrations in Ontario of a shooting alliance, with 1114 and 2056 being a predominantly shooting alliance. And you can even see in Finals 2 how that shooting alliance lost to Rotors and Hangs. Yeah, I see you pulling up the score right there, and Team Dave actually pulled out the win there, I believe, by having 2 Rotors in autonomous, and as well as 3 Rotors, 3 Hangs to the Red Alliance's 40 kPa, 1 Rotor in autonomous, 2 Rotors total, and 2 Hangs. And that last Hang actually gave the Blue Alliance the win.
Very, very interesting. And so in that match, I'm even seeing here that they managed to hold 2056 1114 to only 2 Rotors in that particular case. So was there any defense also employed for that particular match to make that happen, or?
I'm sure that there was some defense from Dave's side. Dave is such a great defensive team as well, from past years as well. But I do think that there were, I think it did come down to congestion for the gears and just 6 robots on the field at once. Sometimes, robots just choose the wrong path and they have to make up for it by taking 5 seconds to drive in a different direction.
Mm. But that's really interesting to even know that a gear-centric alliance was at least able to steal one match out of what has normally been a pretty formidable pairing with 2056 and 1114. And so that's some pretty neat commentary with that one. But in terms of the shooting prowess, I think both of you guys are right in saying that this has probably been the best display of shooting amongst an alliance so far in Ontario. And they obviously did win the tournament, but they certainly didn't clean sweep it much in the way that maybe some people could have expected them, especially given their shooting superiority. So for the gear cyclers out there, it maybe holds out a little bit of hope that, that four-rotor strategy up against a 40 kPa shooting strategy might hold water, but we'll get a chance to analyze a few more competitions to really see how that played out. All right, well, we'll move over to the Georgian event, which I believe both of you guys competed at. And Georgian was a really interesting one. But Paulina, why don't you share your thoughts about the Georgian event? What did you see there that might have been a little bit interesting?
Georgian was a lot of fun. There were a lot of great teams there. There were quite a few bots that could shoot, and mainly Georgia was mainly focused on gears, but you needed those bots that could shoot to break some ties. And there were some very close games. I know some teams lost by 3 points, by 2 points, and it was just because of maybe 1 or 2 balls in auto. And it was crazy over there. But I think the biggest part was the gears. If you choose to go for the 4 rotors, then you really gotta have a good alliance, like a very consistent alliance to get that 4-rotor match. And I don't believe anyone really tried for the 40 kPa though. They definitely did balls to break the ties, but I don't think anyone really went for the 40 kPa at Georgian.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that, where there was really a convergence on 3 rotors and climb. And the shooters did make a really big difference at Georgian, but not by going for the 40 kPa, exactly what you were saying, Paulina. They usually ended up being just that little difference maker where, once you converged on that score of three climbs and 3 rotors, plus your autonomous scores, whether it was through movement or actually getting a gear on, with those really close matches, a lot of the times, just like you said, matches were only won by a handful of points. At Georgian, it was crazy how many games that we saw that I think were decided by 10 points or less. I know the stats here in terms of the average win margin being down at 60.5, 67.5. Like, that's a deceptively high number, but it was really, really, I think, relatively speaking, quite low. If I flip over to Waterloo, their average win margin was 100. I haven't looked at the other events, but I wouldn't be surprised if it was quite a bit more than 60 points. 107 at Windsor, and at Western, 74.5. So yeah, a little bit tighter there, but of our 4 competitions, Georgian definitely had the closest matches. And yeah, I was impressed because the shooters ended up making a big difference in a lot of the matches, just from their incremental points and not even needing to get the 40 kPa bonuses, because we are looking here right across this line, not a single 40 kPa bonus was achieved the entire time. Even for the 4-rotor matches, there were only 2 in quals and only 1 in the elimination rounds. And in fact, at Waterloo, I don't think it was that much better. Waterloo, there were only 4 in quals. There's only 1 in the elimination round. So, actually, both these guys were really 3-rotor centric strategies with shooting making the difference between the two. And you just had slightly, well, I won't say slightly, but you did have better shooters at Waterloo than at Georgian. But at Georgian, you had a lot more shooters, which were okay, and it made for a lot of really interesting tight matches. Max, any other thoughts on Georgian?
I think what Paulina and you have been talking about in the past couple of minutes about how close the matches were, I think that's absolutely accurate. If you look at Finals 1 of Georgian, the win was decided by 1 point, and it was because the shooter, Warp 7 actually, shot during autonomous, and they hit a really crazy accurate 10 balls in autonomous. I think they hit 8 or 9, and that ended up giving that 1-point lead to the Blue Alliance to take that. And then even if you look at Finals 2, it was won by 5 points by Red Alliance. And I know Finals 3 had the red card on Blue Alliance, but the unofficial score before that was 277 to 272. So all in all, between the 3 matches, there were only 11 points difference.
Which is absolutely nuts, absolutely nuts. Like, there were some really entertaining finals, but 100%, I think that final series probably wraps up the entire Georgian event in a nutshell, with tight matches coming down to, you know, just a few fuel shots in auto making the difference between them. Because as we'd mentioned, 4976 was a pretty capable shooter, not necessarily able to get, you know, the full 40 kPa on their own. 5406, pretty decent shooter as well. 865, you know, if you haven't seen them, they're a pretty good shooter themselves as well. So despite the fact that you won't really hear much said about Georgian's shooters, they ended up playing a very huge factor in how that competition was decided. So really great. Check out those matches on video if you ever get a chance to. But some really great commentary on the Georgian event. One of our new events, so maybe not as many people watching it, but if you did, you were treated to quite the show out there, that's for sure. And then moving on to Windsor, where this was one that I personally had a chance to see, and some very interesting things that happened at Windsor as well, especially when we look at the statistics there. But I'll swing this one back over to Paulina. Paulina, did you get a chance to watch Windsor at all?
I got the chance to watch a few qual matches. I went to visit Western actually during Windsor, so I didn't get to watch all of them. But the matches that I did watch, really impressive. Like the robots on the field, they could either shoot a lot better than Georgian, or they did gears a lot faster. Maybe not as accurately, but they definitely got quite a few over there.
Yeah, I'd have to agree that there were some good shooters out there, but not as many. I don't think we necessarily saw fuel being shot in every match, but the Killer Bees took a trip out to Canada and crossed the border, and so they were probably the top shooter at the event, and you know, there were some other shooters out there like 4917, 610 is also, I guess, considered a low volume shooter. But there are a few more out there who could also hit shots, but maybe not quite at the 40 kPa level. But Max, for Windsor, what were your thoughts on Windsor?
I think one of the really interesting highlights is the difference between the, again, it always goes back to this, the Four Rotors versus the 40 kPa. In one of the qualification matches, the Killer Bees, which I think was the most consistent 40 kPa bot at the event, if not the only, actually lost a match even though they hit the 40 kPa. And then going all the way on to finals, the number 1 seed Alliance lost to the number 3 seed in only 2 matches because there were, because of the 4 rotor strategies, and 4 rotors just, you know, increase the points by 100 points plus the 40 for the actual rotor. And it's just really, really cool to see teams being able to upset, you know, such an amazing team like 33 and also Saberbyte 772 just by playing their own game. And that's exactly what 610 did, and that's how they beat Big Bang and Theory 6 in semis, and that's exactly how they made it all the way to the finals.
Yeah, that was actually quite shocking to me when 33 went out there in a match and they put on an absolute show, firing in, you know, close to the 40 kPa in autonomous. Didn't quite get there, but they got pretty darn close, and then proceeded to finish it off, and then proceeded to, you know, cycle a good number of gears, and then lo and behold, they end up losing the match. And, you know, that's totally on point, where that might have been this match right here, Quals 54, 275. No, they didn't quite get the 40 kPa here. I don't think they did, at least. But there was definitely a match where that happened. And, you know, they lost to an Alliance that could just pop out the 4 rotors. And so what's really interesting on the insights page for this event, is basically just the number of four-rotor matches. In the qualification rounds, we really only saw 6 of them, which is still a pretty good number. I mean, if you compare that to Waterloo, Waterloo only had 4 in the qualification rounds. Georgian only had 2. And then all of a sudden, Windsor here, 6, not too bad. But then in the playoffs, this is where things just get a little bit crazy. Like there were 8 four-rotor matches in the playoffs at Georgian. And legitimately, I would say 3 out of the 8 alliances were capable of putting up the 4 rotors, and not under like perfect conditions. These were legitimately 4 rotor alliances that could do it even if you threw up defense against them. And as I look at the bracket for who moved on through the semis and into the finals, those 3 alliances that were capable of putting up 4 rotors, which I would say would be the 610, 49, 17, 45, 95 alliance, the 1285, 1241, 4902 alliance, and this alliance, which kind of came out of, I shouldn't say it came out of nowhere, because we'll probably talk about some of these teams later on, but 5885, 5426, and 4920 at any given time could just throw up 4 rotors, probably without breaking too much of a sweat in some cases, because during some of these 4-rotor matches, this is where things got really testy, because at the end of some of these matches, we actually saw the pilots hold up how many extra gears they delivered, even after finishing up the 4 rotors. Like it was almost comical to see, but they were just showing off a little bit, but it was pretty entertaining. But having said that, the 3 alliances that were capable of doing the 4 rotors all made it to the semis. And yeah, this is probably an interesting case to maybe use some ammunition for the 4-rotor alliance versus the 40 kPa shooting alliance, and whether a 4-rotor strategy can beat a shooting alliance, which is going to depend on 3 rotors, even if you have to do that through defense. So pretty interesting case study on this one. But last but not least, let's spend a little bit of time talking about Western. And unfortunately, I wasn't able to attend Western, but Paulina, I'll let you have the first word on Western again, since you had a chance to catch a few matches there in person. But Paulina, what did you see at Western?
Yeah, I actually got to visit Western for a short time period on Saturday. It's a new event, which is great, and it's a huge facility, a lot more seating than Georgian. But before the matches, I got to see like 4039 and 5024 play, and they were very impressive. I know for most qual matches, people were gonna try and go for the 4 rotors. Maybe didn't get it all that much, but they were definitely gonna go and try for it. After the 3 rotors, you kind of see how much time is left, and then you kind of determine whether you want to stay over on your side and just wait for the climb, or you want to just go all out and go for the 4 rotors. And I think at points it did work, but I think for the most part, people just stayed on their side and waited for the ropes to drop to climb if you could not shoot.
Max, did you get a chance to catch any of the Western matches?
Yeah, I was able to catch some of the matches, but what intrigued me the most was kind of looking at the statistics behind some of the teams in the eliminations, where the number 2 ranked OPR team by OPR 2200 got knocked out in quarters. 2200 paired up with team 2935 Naki, and it's just really interesting to see, a 3rd seed looking at, going all the way around, is our 3, mid-tier OPR teams better than 2 high OPR teams, right? And that's kind of what we saw kind of in 2014, where 3 very, capable robots that can drive around could necessarily beat 2 very dominant teams and a robot that might have had, drive issues.
Right, and,
so that's really cool to see.
And I have to ask, was that 3rd robot being able to climb or not being able to climb? Do you have any idea if that was a factor in that particular matchup in the quarters?
I'm not actually sure about the specifics for that.
Yeah. But having said that, though, highlighting the 6 alliance, which eliminated them, this is something that we're seeing a lot more common is, first of all, the lower ranked alliance being able to pull off the upset. But secondly, we're seeing a lot of young teams. So that number 6 alliance who beat 2 very good, very veteran teams in 2200 and 2935. I don't think if you had asked me whether they were going to lose that matchup to, basically 310s, which are in the 5,000s and even greater, you probably wouldn't take that bet. But pretty amazing that you did see them move on. And even again with 6378 Lynx, which you'd mentioned before, captaining, the number 2 alliance as a very, very young team and making it all the way to the finals. Definitely a storyline to pay attention to. But going back to your original point on OPR, strangely, OPR has not been really the greatest predictor, excuse me, at determining who the ultimate winners of an event were going to be. This year, depending on how much stake you put into OPR in the past, this came up in one of our earlier webinars where a lot of people said, well, it's not a super great predictor. And I'd be curious maybe for a future webinar to maybe look at the OPRs and just to see what the correlations have been to success at those events. But beyond that, thanks very much, guys, for your insight from Western. But we're going to move on very quickly. And maybe let's talk about a surprise team or two here, because this has been a year where we've seen a good number of teams kind of come out of the woodwork, have breakout years. Max, I'll fire this one over to you first. Have there been any teams this year that have really caught your eye?
I think 5885 really, really caught my eye, especially because I got a chance to work with a drive team at both Georgian and at Windsor, and a primarily gear cycling team with, not too complex of a machine. Simplicity just makes them such a strong and very deadly team going up against them, and very beneficial and amazing partnership to have when you're going with them. 5885, I believe, kind of almost relied on just having a really strong strategy, as well as driver prowess when it came down to winning a lot of qualification matches and seeding high at Windsor, but then also making it through into eliminations.
I wish we could pull up a picture of their robot here, but there's not one on the Blue Alliance. But for 5885, excuse me, for those of you who've had a chance to see them at competition, you may not have noticed them because they're not super memorable, other than the fact that if you actually see their robot, it's made predominantly out of copper tubing, in fact. So it's a pretty cool looking bot, but how did they get there? Understated gear cycler, super reliable climber. And so kind of a very straightforward 2-part formula, which has proven to be really successful. But I just wanted to kind of prove to the audience once and for all that these guys are for real, because these are the results from Windsor, where they only made it as far as the semifinals, which is a little bit crazy because they played 6 matches in the playoffs, and in half their matches, they scored 445 points. So quarterfinals, boom, boom. Lost the first match, came back with 445, and then in the semifinals again, they win their one match in the semifinals with a score of 445. So definitely some convergence on their score, and you can probably predict with the score of 445 exactly how they did that. Basically you're engaging. They didn't do a whole lot in autonomous other than get their mobility, but bang, to get that 445, they were just 4-rotor demons out there, getting 4 rotors in every single one of those matches where they hit 445. Excuse me, getting 1 rotor in autonomous. And basically, once you do that with your 3 climbs, 445 should be a pretty common number that a lot of strategians are seeing out there, where that's kind of your base level 4 rotor. And strategically, they dialed in on that and constructed, the best alliance that they could at optimizing those 4 rotors. And they definitely did that. So watch out for those guys, because I think they're going to make some noise out there. Watch out for them, especially if they fly under the radar and end up being able to captain an alliance, maybe in the later rounds, which is precisely kind of what they did here. Well, actually, not even in the later rounds. They captained the number 4 alliance at Windsor. But if they get an opportunity to, they're probably going to pick up some really great gear cyclers and just kind of cram those 4 rotors, as quickly as possible and apply pressure that way. So definitely a really, really interesting team for sure. Paulina, I think you'd mentioned there were some surprises, maybe not from a specific team so far this year, but generally speaking, you have been surprised by some teams. Do you care to tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, definitely the rookies this year have really climbed up, and with a rookie team, you never know. They could be one of the top teams or maybe not. I know one of the best teams I've seen so far is 6378 Lynx. They were a district event finalist twice and highest rookie seed. And they competed at Ryerson and Western. And I got to see them at both, which was awesome. They were like, I loved watching them. They were really great to watch. And they did, I think for Ryerson, they competed with 5024 and then became finalists and then lost to 5024, which is still pretty amazing, like, to compete at such a high level for a rookie team.
Yeah, I saw these guys at Ryerson, and I thought it was actually pretty insane that they were picked so late in the draft because they were so good, but they were amazing pickup, only to lose in the finals to 6-10, 11-14, and 55-96, which were going to be pretty tough alliance to beat on that day, that early in the season for sure. But what I really want to point out with these guys is that they went from being, a second pick at Ryerson and making it to the finals to captaining. They were ranked second overall at the end of qualifications, and they ended up captaining the second alliance all the way to the finals, and up against, like you said, 5024 Raider and Makeshift, which is a pretty formidable alliance again. But in terms of improvement of performance from event to event, that's pretty spectacular for any team, let alone a set of rookies. So if they continue on that kind of upward trend, I'm a little bit scared to see where they're going to be at the district champs. And I'm pretty sure 63-78 right here, ranked 8th, rookie team with 114 points, our highest ranked rookie in Ontario, and that's by a landslide at this point. 63-47 is the next highest with 86, but they're locked in. They're going to sneak in under the radar, I think, despite the fact that they're ranked 8th in the province. But they could be a great pickup or just a dark horse for sure. Max, any other final teams that may have caught your eye?
1 second. I think 5024 Raider, we've talked about them a lot, but I think that this has been, again, a really great year for them with that Chairman's Award and the win. And I believe they also made it very far in their first event. And again, with ranking number 2 for total points this year.
Yeah, and this is not even, a great robot that they put together, which it is a great robot, but even with the District Chairman's Award and winning that double crown at the Western event was absolutely huge. And I guess I didn't see that as a surprise, having seen this team in operation at Ryerson. I think you just kind of had this feeling that good things were going to happen for them at some point, if not this season, but next season. But really, really great to see them win a tournament, make it to the finals, then win a tournament and win district chairmans. This is definitely an up-and-coming team, which, I think we all now know about them in Ontario, but if the rest of the world hasn't really paid attention to these guys and they're trying to figure out who are the next set of up-and-coming teams to come out of Ontario, I think you got to put 5024, kind of at the top of the list for now. But really breakout season for them. Really interesting. All right. Before we take some questions from the audience, this is one topic that I wanted to pick both of your brains about, because I rarely get the opportunity to have, panelists who've been involved with their teams and maybe who are looking at both sides of this strategy. um, but what's been up for debate, at least in Ontario up until now, and probably for the next few weeks, is we tend to have a few alliances who can pursue one of two different types of strategies. One strategy is get your 3 rotors and try and get your 40 kPa as quickly as possible. So if you've got, a pretty good auton shooting robot, which gets you close to 40 kPa, take one of your robots and just try and finish that up to 40 kPa during teleop, and then squeeze out your 3 rotors as quickly as possible, and then kick over into pure defense mode and just kind of hang on for the win once you achieve the 3 rotors and the 40 kPa. And then once we saw that strategy become quite successful pretty early on in the competition, and I think maybe the best example of that so far would be both Ryerson and Waterloo. Kind of the rest of the teams who aren't shooting particularly well or who've chose to focus on gear cycling, we're left asking, well, how do we beat those teams who are doing the 3 rotor plus 40 kPa? Can we stack up against that strategy with just a pure cycling, just go all out for the 4 rotors? And so now that we've got 5 weeks of data points, I definitely want to hear from both of our panelists, kind of how do you feel about these two strategies? Does the 4 rotor strategy have a chance against the 3 rotor 40 kPa? If you had a chance to build robots from scratch and pursue one of these two, which one would you choose, and has your mind sort of changed since the beginning of the season? But Paulina, well, I want to send this one over to you first. Like, what are your thoughts on this question and these two particular strategies?
I think for Ontario, 4 rotors is definitely going to be more popular, but the 3 rotor and 40 kPa can challenge that. I know that the shooters on Ontario maybe aren't the best, but if you have a good enough bot that can shoot, maybe you'll pick 2 other bots who can do gears fairly well, get those 3 rotors done, and then just focus on shooting and trying to keep the other alliance off from doing the 4 rotors, because I think majority of the robots in Ontario can do gears, and most of them do gears fairly well. So I think 4 rotors is definitely going to be a more popular strategy rather than 3 rotors and 40 kPa. There are going to be teams, though, I think, that are going to Ontario District Champs where they're going to go for the 4 rotor and 40 kPa. And I think depending on who's in an alliance together, that can actually happen. I would not be surprised if that happened at Ontario District Champs.
That's interesting, because that's a whole other question that we'll ask, where, how does the 4 rotor plus 40 kPa stack up versus just the 4 rotors? But we'll get to that question in a little bit. But Paulina, I just wanted to ask one maybe final question here with respect to what you said. One thing we have not really seen yet, at least not to my knowledge, is 2 alliances go head-to-head employing each one of these strategies at a pretty high level. So if we took some of our better robots in Ontario who were doing the 3 rotor plus 40 kPa, and you put them up against some of our better pure 4 rotor alliances today, would you give the advantage to one or the other at this stage, or is that something you're not really quite willing to commit to?
I don't think I'd be willing to commit to either yet, because 4 rotors, it's going to be hard, but once you get it, and it'll put you ahead. But if you get the 40 kPa and you still have more time to get even more, that could potentially pull you ahead. But I can't commit to either one right now, because I would have to see more of the teams focus on 3 rotor and 40 kPa versus the 4 rotors, because in playoffs, most teams, I think, would focus on the 4 rotors and then the 40 kPa afterwards. But at a certain point, during the match. If you get the 3 rotors and you look at the time, if there's enough time to do that 4th rotor, I think they're definitely going to go for that. But if not, if there's a robot that can shoot, they're probably going to go over and just rack up those points, because the shooting will most likely be the difference maker, especially if all 3 robots can climb consistently and get those 3 rotors.
All right, Max, how about you? What are your thoughts on this burning question in terms of these 2 strategies? Would you give one an advantage over the other right now, or not necessarily?
I think that any strategist will really look at this and say, 4 rotors is 260 points in teleop, 180 points to 3 rotors plus 40 kPa. That's a big difference to have to make up for, your autonomous points and for, shooting above the kPa. And I don't think, I wish we could find a statistic for this, but I don't think any 4-rotor elimination match has lost to a non-4 rotor elimination alliance. And that's, I think, just because how incredible the points are. And of course, hangs are going to be the big deciding factor in that. And I think if all hangs are equal, both alliances have the equal amount of hangs, then 4 rotors will always win. But then the gamble is, and that's the kind of game that we play on Bang, if we can't make those 4 rotors, is stopping that 4th rotor. Because you spend a lot of time getting the exponential number of gears. You have to get 6 gears to get that last rotor. If you can stop them at that last rotor, at that last gear, then all of those points, 140 points, is now lost, and they waste precious time gambling for it. So, as much as 4 rotors, as long as it's successful, would always beat the 3 rotor and 40 kPa, it is a gamble, and it comes down to how successful do you know your team, your alliance is going to be on the 4 rotors.
All right, so Max, I've got a follow-up question for you on that one, because if we look at the numbers back at Windsor, where legitimately we had 3 out of the 8 alliances able to score that 4th rotor, and 3 out of the 8 is not 3 out of the 8 is excuse me, like 37%. And if they had scored 4 rotors every single one of their matches, we would have seen about 37% of 4 rotors engaged. Now, we didn't quite see that. We only saw about 23.5%. But that still tells me that teams who wanted to score 4 rotors were pretty darn successful. And at Windsor, we saw teams playing defense. We saw them trying to stop the 4 rotors. But I guess a lot of the burning question involves, can you stop the 4 rotors? And now that we've seen a few more matches played in Ontario, are the gear cyclers actually good enough that, is a 3 rotor plus 40 kPa alliance, even if you choose to dedicate 1 robot strictly to defense for the entire match, and even if you dedicate more than 1 robot, maybe your strength is the 3 rotor plus 40 kPas to get the 3 rotors and the 40 kPa as quickly as possible. And we've seen teams do this with like 80, 90 seconds left in the match, and you can shift off all 3 robots to playing defense. At that point, can you stop the 4 rotors? But I guess, put it succinctly, Max, can you stop the 4 rotor alliance? Like, is it easier said than done? Based on what you saw at Windsor, is the 4 rotor, as easily stopped as people might have thought, or not nearly as easy to stop?
I think the perfect example is, again, finals, where Killer Bees, a 40 kPa shooter bot versus 610 and 4917. I think anyone's strategy has to be to shut down that 4th rotor, but I think it also shows that, with that gamble, they're not going to be shooting balls. They're not going to be going for autonomous high goal. So the 40 kPa I don't think is actually too necessary to actually hit the 40 kPa mark. If you only hit 20 kPa, that's enough to tie break the tie, if that would happen.
Mm-hmm. So it's a very...
do you think...
No, go ahead, Max. Sorry about that.
I do think that it's easier said than done to shut down a 4 rotor alliance, because it's in some matches, 4917, I believe, actually had all 4 rotors by 45 seconds and is already spinning on the scoreboard. But I think it does come down to, if you can successfully shut the alliance down, that let's say they only get that last gear in the last 30 seconds or the last 15 seconds, then playing that extra bit of defense, having 33, forego the 40 KPA and have them play defense for more of the match to slow down that other alliance, then I do think that it's absolutely possible. And again, that's I think what we're going to see at District Champs is where which one's going to be better, the defense or the speed of those four rotors.
But at least we have some numbers to play with, because like you said, that's not a number I was keeping track of, but you're saying that the 4917 alliance was able to get four rotors spinning with 45 seconds left in the match. So that's kind of like a 15-second cushion if you don't encroach in your last 30 seconds, which you kind of want to spend climbing. But excuse me, that's a pretty good margin when you have such talented gear cyclers in that alliance. That's a fair amount of time to play with, and if you're playing defense to try and stop that, that's a good amount of time that you need to slow that alliance down. Now, having said that, the makeup of the 4917 alliance was a little bit interesting because they actually were able to get three cyclers on their alliance. 4595 was not a defense robot. In fact, 4595 was cycling along with 4917 and 610, and they were good for a handful of gears to help out the cause in addition to climbing. So that was an interesting makeup of that particular alliance. But all-out offense for the four rotors in this case appeared to have taken out a three-rotor 40 KPA alliance, because 33 was the primary shooter, but 772 was also a pretty capable shooter, where their role was basically to top up and get that additional to get the 40 KPA as quickly as possible, and then they would run cycles. And then 6331 was more on the defense role, and then to climb at the end. So a very interesting case analysis for that particular strategy breakdown. And then, of course, last but not least, I just wanted to ask very quickly about this one. Four rotors and 40 KPA. This is kind of like the unicorn strategy, and for those of you who can actually achieve it. But Paulina, are we going to see this? What are your thoughts?
Oh, I definitely think we'll see it at least once at Ontario District Champs, if not more times. And I love the name that you gave it, the unicorn. But this is the 40 KPA and the four rotor. I definitely think is possible. I think it's definitely going to happen in a qual match, because in a qual match you can get an alliance with three top teams, and ooh, if that happens, I can't wait to watch. But in playoff, it's going to be a lot harder to do that, but I don't think it's going to be impossible.
Max, how about on your end? What are your thoughts on the four-rotor 40 KPA? Is it going to happen? And is it a good strategy? Which seems like a crazy question to ask, because you would think that it's going to be a good strategy, but that may foreshadow another question that I might have for both of you guys. But four-rotor 40 KPA, what do you think?
Absolutely what Paulina said. I do think it's going to happen in District Champs. It might even happen in a quals match where kind of, I guess, the unicorn strategy gets the unicorn alliance of three teams that won't necessarily get dropped to a third robot or a second pick. So, for example, let's say 610, 1114, 2056, they all get put into the same alliance on quals, which is, a unicorn alliance is, three very elite teams. I think they're going to go for the four rotors 40 KPA. But then when it comes to eliminations, it does matter on, can you get that third robot to be a cycling bot like 610 did at Windsor? Do you have the strength to do the KPA in autonomous so you can leave teleop to grab those rotors, right? I hope it will happen, and I do think that the alliance that will get that will truly be a unicorn alliance and hopefully come out with a win in the district event.
Yeah, I would have to agree with both of you in that, we'll definitely see the four-rotor 40 KPA. It's happened, I think, down in California and probably a few other places as well, but California is the one place that I'm 100% sure of it happening. I have an interesting one, though, maybe to throw out to you guys in that, if you had an alliance that was capable of doing the four-rotor 40 KPA, how that might stack up against like a pure four-rotor alliance. And here's my hypothetical situation. Most alliances that we've seen so far who are going to try and do this and who have pretty talented shooters, they're still not quite getting the 40 KPA entirely in autonomous, which means they've got to break off one of their robots, maybe two, depending on how you want to do this, to shoot an extra few balls for maybe the first 20 or 30 seconds of tele-op, just to top up your 40 kPa. And then presumably you'll switch over to scoring gears just to finish up the four rotors. Now, hypothetically, if you're up against an alliance which is only doing the four rotors, because you're spending time in tele-op just topping up the 40 kPa, there's a possibility you could fall behind the pure four-rotor alliance in terms of your gears. And so if your opponents who are only doing the four rotors and not even worried about the 40 kPa, if they get their four rotors first and then switch over into pure defense mode and are somehow able to shut down your last few remaining gears, yeah, it's great that you've got the 40 kPa, but Max, you did the math already where the 40 kPa doesn't make up for the difference between three rotors versus four rotors. And so I'm wondering if there might be an alliance which would try and take advantage of that. But once again, that advantage is only there if an alliance can't score the full 40 kPa in autonomous. And so for you elite scoring shooters out there who are just missing that 40 kPa, that's going to be, I think, something that will crop up at district champs in the elimination rounds, when if you're going to be trying legitimately for this strategy and if you're not hitting that 40 kPa in autonomous, a pure four-rotor alliance is going to put a lot of pressure on you and might make you pay for trying to get those 40 kPa topped up and falling behind on your rotors. I don't know. Paulina or Max, do you think that could be something that's viable or a little crazy? I'll leave it to either one or both of you guys.
I think that the 40 kPa is, as a coach, you have to make that call. What's my priorities in this match? Do I tell my team to break off and do that 40 kPa, top it up, or do I have them start with the rotors? And in my opinion, I would actually have them start with the rotors, have that extra time to get that kPa in. And if you can't do it, then just hope that however much kPa you have in autonomous is enough to break a tie. And a pure four-rotor versus four-rotor plus kPa, no matter if it's 40 kPa or not, I think that as long as the hangs and the autonomous are similar, then that extra, the tie-breaking pressure will be what determines the alliance. And I do think that as long as you have the priorities straight, where you get the four rotors before the 40 kPa, you make sure you get the hang, you don't sacrifice the hang for the 40 kPa, will be, the dominant and the winning alliance over the four-rotor pure alliance.
Yeah, I think that's definitely going to be an adjustment that we'll see, because for most alliances which have been trying to get the 40 kPa, they've been shooting early at the beginning of tele-op. You're probably right that it makes a little more sense now to shoot at the end after you've gotten your four rotors, and it's convenient because you're going to be back at your airship to line up for the climb anyway, so you're in that general area. So that's probably an adjustment, a slight difference that we'll see at district champs. Yeah, but it makes it interesting because the balls in the hopper will not be available late game, because presumably they'll be dumped by that point. So you'll probably have to depend on either ground pickup or feeding balls in through the slot. So that might be an interesting thing to keep an eye on. And overall, I just think it's a little bit tougher to be shooting at the end of a match, just from a driver psychological standpoint, to line up and make those shots where you need to make every single one of those count and feel the pressure of needing to climb immediately after. So that'll be interesting. I think you're right. For anyone who's going to attempt the four rotor 40 kPa, I think their textbook strategy on how they sequence their scoring is going to change up, where they'll probably push their shooting closer to the end of the match. In which case, though, again, if you're up against a pure four rotor team, maybe you'll see some teams there react, knowing that, hey, they still need some time to shoot those shots, and may hang around in the key, the opposing key, which is a little risky, just to make sure that they can disrupt that shooting, knowing that it's going to happen at the end of the match. So a lot of different metagame things to consider. All right, ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to actually skip through because we've gone over on time just a little bit here. My apologies, but I think there have been a few questions that I'm hoping I can ask Mr. Keenan, Mr. Paul Keenan, our first senior mentor, who's joined us on the call. Paul, glad to have you with us. Would you be able to get some questions from the audience out?
Sure, we do have a few questions. One of them that seems to be most pressing is, what do you think the minimum score will be to make the district championship?
Oof. Okay. So mathematically, this is a really hard one to give you a definitive answer. But going back to FRC locks, if we're already looking around this area where we're in the 60 mark, we're seeing people who have already been mathematically eliminated at 48 points. So you definitely need to have more than 48 points. As I scroll up here, though, more so in the teams which now kind of have like a 50-50 chance to get in here, you're probably looking somewhere in the 60s range to be looking at a spot in the district champs. I can't give anything more definitive than that, but this is a really good website, and I would say if your odds are kind of hovering around this area, I guess being a math teacher, basically if I was team 1075 sitting at 68 points, I might start trying to make some arrangements to see, how I'm going to be traveling at district championships. If I'm 5596, I might still be making those bookings just to make sure, but you're probably going to be hovering around this area for the number of points, but I can't get any more definitive than that until the final matches are played, because mathematically, technically, it's actually still possible if a perfect storm happens for a team even with 79 points, technically, to be eliminated. Mathematically, if things worked out perfectly, it's certainly still possible. But Alan, I wish I could give you a definitive one, but I think that's the best that we'll ever be able to do at this stage in the game.
So we have a question and a comment from Parth. He says, with so many gear robots, the gear auto success rates are disappointing in a lot of cases, especially on the sides. At provincials, two-rotor auto can be huge, especially on gear-only alliances. Is it worth it for teams to just dedicate time to gear autonomous?
Oh, this is a tough one. I think I need a few seconds to think about this one. Paulina, Max, do either of you guys have any strong opinions about two-rotor auto, which has been difficult to say the least? We've seen it happen in first. I'm not sure if we've seen it at all in Ontario specifically.
I believe we did see it in Ontario. I think it happened in Waterloo with 4678 Cybercavs and 3683 Team Dave. Yeah, I think during finals they may have had a two-rotor match.
Finals 2. Yeah.
The two-rotor auto is kind of, you'd have to have really skilled pilots to do it. Either because you're gonna have to, you only have 15 seconds to get all three up, all three gears up, and then engage the rotors. So you have to be able to work really well with the other pilot up in that airship.
It's a 20-point advantage over the one-rotor auto, so that's kind of how I look at it. The level of difficulty for 20 points. Generally, this is how I analyze a question like this. It's like, are there easier ways to get 20 more points? And the tough part is once we start playing this game at the district champs, we're playing at such a high level where, all the easy 20 points have already been scored. All your climbs are assumed to be done. Your three rotors are done. Your first set of 20 points from your first rotor in auto is done. So how else do you score 20 points at that point? Well, from gears, you can't really do it. You have to score basically 140 points by getting your fourth rotor, at least in playoffs. Alternatively, you can score 20 points worth of pressure, which is 60 shots. So let me think about this. Is it easier to make 60 shots, or is it easier to coordinate 2 more gear autos and train up your pilots to get them into your airship? Oh, that's a hard one.
Sorry to interrupt, but just wanted to put out there that 1285 and 1241 actually accomplished this in qualifications, and it was actually our own pilots, and we were hoping to do this in eliminations, but unfortunately we couldn't actually get the straight ahead autonomous working, which is funny because it seems like the simplest one. But I do think that a lot of it does come down to a bit of the pegs do have a bit of tolerance that could change the autonomous, but at the same time, it is very, very difficult for two pilots to manipulate all three of those gears and then, put one, up on the first rotor and the two onto the second. And as difficult as it is, I do think that is very feasible.
Interesting. I would say given that, and knowing that it was actually your straightforward autonomous, which was more tricky, can you depend on your alliance captain, your first pick, to have a side gear autonomous? Maybe. Can you depend on your third pick to have the straightforward, taking into effect the tolerances that you just said, Max? Maybe. And is all of that easier than trying to squeeze out 60 more boiler shots? I would say, based on all the shooters that I've seen in Ontario so far, yeah, I would say that trying to coordinate 3 gears in auto and training up your pilots to get them spinning for 2 rotors is probably still easier than trying to squeeze out 60 more boiler shots at this stage. So I would go for it. I would go for the 2 rotor auto, because I think that's your next best opportunity to score those 20 points. Because I think your alternatives are a little bit more difficult. That's an interesting one. Sorry, go ahead, Paul.
Sorry. Parth has another question. He says, many teams have now scored 4 rotors in matches. Should these teams now be looking at how to stop 4 rotors to know where to improve? Can you stop 4 rotors?
Yeah, I mean, there's really no other options left. I mean, other than the first question that Parth asked, which is to score points in autonomous. If you've got a robot that doesn't shoot, first of all, or is an okay shooter, but is really only like an incremental shooter, and I happen to know that Parth is from Team 610, and that's probably the exact robot that we're talking about right now. 610 is probably not going to squeeze out 60 made shots in teleop. Yeah, and assuming that you do pursue the autonomous for those extra 20 points, the only net gains is in your points at that point is to stop your opponents, and your easiest way to stop them is, it's a weird one. It's, do you stop the 4 rotors or do you stop the 40 kPa? Those are your 2 options depending on who you're up against, but I think you got to focus on stopping the 4 rotors, and then how do you stop them? I had a slide here on defense, which I think we've all got some very interesting opinions on how you play defense legally to try and stop those 4 rotors. But yeah, I think, if I was kind of in that situation, I'd probably put a lot of energies into playing defense. And this is an interesting one. Again, if you're talking about those 20 points that you're trying to get an auto, is it easier to stop your opponents from scoring 20 points and focus your energies there? Probably, because you're not just stopping 20 points, you're stopping 140 points in the elimination rounds. But yeah, I would probably agree with that. Paulina, Max, either of you guys, in terms of, where you put your energies, and can you stop 4 rotors? Can you stop 4 rotors? I think it can be done. But the legalities of it, I think I'm starting to hear a lot of talk of interesting strategies where, is it going to be blockading the field if you do this, this, and this, if you park robots in certain areas, if you position them, on one side of the airship but not the other, but then one in the midfield and then one in the other airship gap. I think there's going to be a lot more teams really dialing in very specific defensive strategies to try and stop that 4th rotor. Hopefully most of it are legal, some of which I think they're really going to toe the line. But Paulina, Max, any thoughts on Parth's question? Can you stop 4 rotors? And is it worth switching over and putting a lot of focus into that at this point?
I think it's definitely worth it if you switch over to defense to stop the 4 rotors. But if you do go over to defense, you gotta know that you can stop them, because if you can't, then you're basically giving up a match, because they may still be able to get the 3 rotors and then go climb. Depending on how the match goes, you could be stuck on their side, which could prevent you from climbing later on, which could be really valuable if you do stop the 4 rotors.
Yeah, and I think that's the key there is like not even withstanding the four rotors, even if you're defending them and trying to stop them from getting the four rotors, inherently you're also defending the climb at the end by pushing the four rotors later and later and later into the match. And so even if they do squeeze out that fourth rotor, um, you may have also created an advantage on your climbs by pushing it so late that they're panicked and not able to get a climb. So, you know, defense late match. If you can, I'd say there's going to be a pretty large and significant advantage to whoever can finish the four rotors first. And whether that means, you know, shifting over to defense to stop your opponent from getting four rotors or subsequently stopping a climb. Yeah, the speed in which you can get your own four rotors is going to become super key. Max, any final thoughts on that one?
Yeah, on that match where 49-17 actually had the fourth rotor by the 45-second mark, even if it's a four rotor versus four rotor alliance, then by 45 seconds, if you have that last gear, then you can, if you're faster than the other team, go shut them down, right? Obviously, the specifics of the defense you would play to stop down gearing teams, and if you know that they don't have a floor intake, which a lot of teams, you know, are starting to see the benefit of, if you can knock up gear off of them while they're trying to put it on the peg, then does waste a lot of time because they now have a wasted gear, a wasted cycle. So hopefully we'll see some really, really interesting defense and some really amazing like head-to-head matchups with robots. And I'm afraid that it might actually look like a little bit more like BattleBots by the end of the season.
Yeah, because we're seeing some crazy stuff happen already where, you know, late game, trying to get that fourth rotor is probably one of the most stressful things I've seen teams try and do, coupled with the climb immediately after that, and coupled with the fact that, you know, a lot of alliances are starting to pick up that late game. They're just starting to fire their extra gears through that loading slot just onto the ground in front of lifts, just trying to gunk up the field to make it really difficult for robots to score and ultimately climb. And so you're kind of fighting through that as well. If you were delayed in sort of getting your fourth rotor and having to do your climb and having to fight through defense, because you could even play defense in such a way that you're, you know, forcing your opponents to drive into that congested area where your human players have just thrown a ton of fuel and gears. And just direct them into that congestion. There's going to be a few really interesting things kind of surface as we go along with respect to all of that. And yeah, I didn't even consider the benefits of an intake in a late game situation like that, because there's going to be gears on the ground down there. And if you had an intake, your opponent probably won't be throwing gears on the ground to try and disrupt you. Or maybe they will, who knows. It's really interesting, though. Paul, any other final questions before we shut it down for the night?
We do have a couple more questions. One is, do you think we'll see a two-shooter alliance 11-14 and 2056 are the best we've seen so far, and they might pick each other and force others to go for the risky four rotors?
That's a really good question. I'm going to have to think about that one. If I'm going to put myself in the shoes of an elite shooter, and let's say one that can get close to the 40 kPa on their own in autonomous, do I pick a robot who is also an elite level shooter, or do I pick a lights out gear specialist? I don't know if I've got to think about that one. But Paulina, Max, why don't you guys take the first crack at that one? Max, Paulina, do either of you feel strongly one way or another about that?
I think that if you know that by your third robot or your second pick, that you can get one of the gear specialists, for example, 4939, or even 4946, I believe, Alpha Dogs. If you can grab them at the kind of coming around, then you can afford to gamble on having that second shooter, because especially if you're looking at, let's say, 772 and 1114, who are both very strong autonomous shooters. You know, like you said earlier, autonomous doesn't really give you all the time to get the 40 kPa, but with two shooters doing that, then there might even be a closer gap where less balls are needed, or one less cycle is needed for retrieving balls, and then they can still get off that four rotor the Four Rotors to get that win. And again, like I think the priority for most teams needs to be, if you can get the Four Rotors, get the Four Rotors. So if it's not possible to have a Four Rotor alliance, knowing that by the time you pick a round, you might not get that gear specialist that you want or that you need, then I don't think it'd actually be that worth it.
Yeah, and this is where things get interesting, because when you mentioned, are they going to be able to pick up a really good gear cycler on the back end of the draft? And this is, I'm probably jumping to conclusions here, but if I was on a team competing this year, this is probably a pretty good conclusion to make, that if 11, 14, and 2056 were able to get together, they would probably be a pretty high-ranked alliance, meaning that they might get a late pick. But I'm even looking right now at the quality of teams which are currently in that 24th position in the district ranking points, just to see what our depth looks like. And I'm going to say you're going to be able to get a pretty darn good robot with the very last pick in the draft at district championships. And I'm talking a robot that's going to be able to cycle a lot of gears for you. And if between 11, 14, and 2056, who are both still pretty darn capable gear cyclers as well, yeah, I probably take that bet. I probably take the two shooters, knowing that you've still got a pretty good shot at getting the Four Rotors. Maybe not as good as the pure Four Rotor alliances, but knowing that you can get that 40 kPa really easily, and probably between those two, they're probably going to get that 40 kPa and then some, with both of them shooting at the same time in autonomous, at least by the time we hit district championships. I don't think that's too much of a stretch to say that. But yeah, I think you're going to force the other teams to go for Four Rotors, and you're probably going to make them go Four Rotors and switch over to defense to try and stop the 40 kPa from being achieved, which you may not be able to do, because if they can hit it in autonomous, you're a little bit stuck.
So our last question is, we have someone who wants to know what your thoughts on where you put your defense robots. That his team has put a lot of energy into trying to figure this out, but he wants to know what your thoughts are on positioning.
Yeah. Paulina, do you have any thoughts on this one? Have you put a lot of thought into defense on your team?
Ooh, defense. For defense, it's going to be a fun thing to do, because you can have all three robots going for gears, and that's fine. But if you're all going to the loading station, there's only two. And if one of your robots isn't the most accurate at loading, it may take a while. So within that time, you can go play defense around their airship, block them off from maybe one or two of the pegs. If you do go and try and block off the two pegs, you'll leave them with one, and you're probably going to want to leave the one peg, the center peg, because that one gives you the least visibility, unless they of course have a camera. That might kind of challenge you a bit, but if you can play good enough defense in a zone that you're comfortable with, that you can actually see, you could definitely do a lot of damage. You could prevent the Four Rotors from happening if you find a good spot for you to defend, and that it's going to weaken you.
Max, how about on your end? Without giving up too many secrets, I suppose, because you probably have been thinking quite a bit about this one, but how do you foresee defense being played as we progress?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. There are some trade secrets I wasn't sure if I'm allowed to share, but definitely what Paulina mentioned about having vision, especially with a defense spot. If your drivers have vision, and especially if you have vision, it means that your opposing alliance probably does not have that vision or has less vision than you. Then that's obviously advantageous, especially if you can play in the gooseneck, or the bottleneck, where the airship is right in front of boiler and right in front of the retrieval zone.
Mm-hmm.
And obviously, the downside of that is, especially because I know Bang likes to put defense in the retrieval zone or right before the retrieval zone, is that if the robot does get too close to that retrieval zone, that's a tech foul.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I really, really, really like to stress, that it's not worth to play that defense in that zone if you're going to get those tech fouls. And, we've been lucky enough to work with some amazing drivers that know their limits and know the line, and they never go across it.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that 100%. Where, I see some of the more successful defensive schemes generally are the ones which just cause the least number of tech fouls. That's first and foremost, because this whole conversation answering Parth's question was for 20 points. How do we squeeze out an extra 20 points? Tech foul is 25 points. So right there, if you get a single tech foul, you've undone all that work that you've done to squeeze out that incremental 20 points. So just do not get tech fouls. And the most common one is from robots who are playing defense in that gap in the retrieval zone, and they just get a little bit too deep into the gap between the airship and the wall and the retrieval zone, and they end up making contact with an opposing robot as they're trying to pick up gears out of that slot. And that's instant death at high levels of this game. So your primary defender, I still think, should be defending, at the opponent's airship, close to that retrieval zone. But where that autonomous line is, you don't want to cross it. You just kind of want to defend the opening of that gap. And even then, that gives you time where if the defender chooses to go around the airship to the other side of it, if you're not inside the gap, if you're just kind of in front of it as a defender, you can easily switch over to the other side and cover the other side of the airship too. So that's been one of the more popular forms of defense that we've seen played. Pretty effective. The only problem is if you get deep. More types of defense are, I think we're going to see teams switch all three robots over to defense for the latter portions of the match, especially if they can create a points advantage earlier on. So we're talking about four rotor alliances that are going to be so dead set focused on getting those four rotors as quick as humanly and robotically possible, and then literally switching all three robots to playing defense and shutting down the opponents. And then the question becomes, how do you do that legally? Because you can't blockade the field. You still have to leave it spread out a little bit, or else you're going to incur penalties or cards, whatever the case may be, while doing that, and you're going to undo all your work. So again, I would say three robots playing defense, something we're going to see, one at the opponent's airship, covering the gaps, primarily the one in the retrieval zone, but then switching over to the other side if the opponents choose to go around the airship. Then I think you need to have like a really strong midfielder who is just like a marking midfielder who, if anyone escapes from that gap, from that first defender, the second robot can kind of pick them up in the midfield, but not get too close to, the opponent's airship, because you can't have two robots kind of blockading in the same area, or else the refs are going to call that. And then last but not least, I think you're going to have another defending robot, again, at the other airship, and just kind of blockading, or not blockading, but covering the gaps again, as the robots are trying now to deliver their gears to the airship. They've still got to cross through one of the gaps in the airship and choose one side to come around. And you have a third defender there just kind of corralling them to one side, or just kind of getting in front of them, preventing them from entering one of those gaps. So, I know there's been a lot of talk about positioning your robots and kind of just parking them in front of lifts. There's some legal technicalities with that. Some permutations of that could be considered illegal. Some of them could be considered legal. Some of it could be left to the interpretation of the head ref at your particular event. So I can't get into the details with that one. I know personally, if I was a drive coach with a team right now, I might be a little bit hesitant to pursue, that type of defense. But, some people are a little bit more confident in their interpretation of the rules on that one. So I'm not going to say yes or no to that one in particular. But I think if it were me, I might just try and employ, three-stage defense, one at each airship covering the gaps, and one in the midfield trying to pick up anyone who sneaks through.
That's it for our questions tonight, Sean.
All right. Well, thanks very much, Paul, for getting those questions out. And just before we break for the night, I'm just going to let everyone know that next week's webinar is going to be a recap of just our 2 final events, North Bay and McMaster, which will be really nice because after those events, we will have our final points ranking and we'll be able to tell teams definitively whether they've qualified or not, and we can really take a look on whether there were any surprises, both for teams that did make it in and maybe for even some of the teams which may have just missed the cut. And so thanks everyone for joining us this evening with an extra special thanks to both Paulina and Max for being our expert panelists. It was a great conversation to be able to mull over, some of the really interesting tournaments that we've played over the last 2 weeks. Very different tournaments, seeing a whole different style of game played in nearly every one, and a lot of different strengths and weaknesses that we've seen from different strategies as well. So thanks everyone, and have yourselves a great night. Take care.
Good night.